Madam Chair, pedophilia and the sexual attraction to minors have for far too long been falsely conflated with criminal behavior. And as a consequence, it's resulted in an inability for the state to truly resolve the lifelong struggles with morality that these pedophiles have. Beyond being extremely myopic and punitive in an attempt to stamp out pedophilia without addressing the root causes of this misunderstood sexual desire, the consequence of this is that we have been utterly helpless in the fight to protect abuse and the sexual exploitation of children. There needs to be a dire and drastic change to our approach to fulfill two key goals. One, that pedophiles need to be recognized as individuals who have no capacity to control or redirect their sexual desires, and two, to better prevent and hopefully eradicate the sexual exploitation of children. So how are we going to do this? Like, my policy is going to be quite long. First, we're going to recognize that pedophilia is a mental disorder. Secondly, we're going to allow it for it to be a mitigating factor in sentencing, the same way any other mental illness reduces criminal liability. We are also going to allow the viewing of child. We are not going to allow we are going to not be punitive in the way we deal with people who just purely view child porn. Third off, we're going to place convicted pedophiles in institutions where they're both incarcerated and in order to obtain treatment. Again, the same way we treat people who commit crimes but are mentally ill. Fourth, we're going to pump in funding in order to identify the psychological causes of pedophilia. Fifth, we're going to provide avenues or to actively set up groups that provide a support structure for pedophiles. And finally, we're going to allow for fair and equal access to treatment or mitigating or coping methods that we may potentially develop later on. But yeah, sure.
How is incarceration and using it as a mitigating circumstance any different from status quo when we treat it as a crime anyway?
Okay, how you need to read a bit more, because how pedophiles are treated right now is they're placed not only on a sex offenders registry list, they are put in maximum security prisons, they get no access to treatment because they don't view it as a disorder in and of itself. They only punish the fact that you have exploited children. We want to change that. If you, for example, commit a crime due to like schizophrenia and the like, you are incarcerated but in a mental institution where you receive help, you receive treatment in order to cope with your disorder later on when you are released. That is the clear difference in this debate. So let's get one thing clear. The abuse and exploitation of children are still going to be criminalized. Coercing children in the production of child porn is still criminal. What we do is, under the eyes of the law and hopefully society in the future, is divorce the sexual attraction to children from acting upon those inclinations in a way that abuses children as a whole. So let's first understand what exactly is pedophilia. Sure, it's a sexual attraction to minors, but we must also recognize that there is an inherent hypocrisy in which we treat and view the concept of sexual attraction across the board. On one hand, we believe that sexual inclinations towards pain and violence or towards the same sex are impossible to change, but at the same time, we fail to appreciate or understand other sexual attractions that do not have a critical mass or create tensions within our own moral principle. Once we recognize that sexual attractions as a whole can't be changed, at the very least, if it results in some particular harm to society, we can then move forward in terms of coping with those methods and trying to find alternative outlets for those sexual desires. But before I go on, yes, last PI.
How do you normally assess the sentiment of pedophilia to whether criminal liability?
How do you assess the sentiment of?
I realize that guys experiencing pedophilia beyond the act of pedophilia.
Okay, look, the only people who have sex with children are people who are attracted to children. So obviously, if you are attracted to children, we're going to recognize that attraction as a disorder and treat it as such. If you have sex with a child, you are then going to be punished under the eyes of the law. So we think that there needs to be a recognition that that sexual attraction can't be changed or can't be changed absent any external help, right? We think that sexual desire is a base function of our physiology and psychology, and there's as a result an inability for us to automatically change those desires under status quo. Why? Because there's currently no state support for the recognition that sexual pedophilia is a particular sexual desire, and as a result, there are no research into methods that could possibly help in addressing those sexual desires or providing a safe and legal avenue in order to actualize those desires. No, you already had two POIs. So let's move on to my next argument. What really constitutes a crime? We argue that under the eyes of the law, as long as you cause particular harm to society, we argue that that should be something that's criminal, right? But more importantly, we judge these crimes on the basis of intent. Recognizing that what you are doing is wrong, could you have stopped yourself from committing that particular crime? We think in the case of pedophiles, they do not have that sort of capacity or agency in order to seek or in order to not commit that crime, because their reality is completely different. That the only way that they can be human and achieve sexual pleasure is through an act with that particular child, right? So if it's so intrinsically tied with their identity and their humanity as a whole, as a result, we cannot be purely punitive in the way we address these particular issues. Moreover, we think our policy never once compromises the legal tenets of our justice system, right? We think that under our policy, we still address the things like, for example, restitution, retribution, and deterrence. How? Because these people are still incarcerated. These people are still treated as criminals ultimately, as long as they exploit a child, right? What we do under our paradigm, right, is we reduce the rate of recidivism, right? Once we address the basal desires of these people, right, we allow for them to change their behaviors once they are let out eventually. And that provides the sort of coping mechanisms that's required in order to prevent the sort of recurrence of exploitation of children. Once they have a legitimate alternative that the state has provided, then there is no longer any excuse to continue exploiting children under this paradigm. So for all these reasons, because we need to recognize that pedophiles do face a long struggle by which they can't automatically change, and we think that there is a need for the state to address the changes in which these people operate under, we're very proud to propose.
Next speaker wishes for his speech to open the case for the opposition amendment. We invite the opposition leader.
Yep. In typical SMU style, they scored the motion. The last time I checked, being treated as a disorder and not a crime meant that you wouldn't be tried. The last time I checked, being tried in a court, being arrested, being sent to any prison irrespective of the security level, and being incarcerated without your consent is the same as committing a crime. Those are all things we do already in status quo. Having a psychologist testify for you as a mitigating circumstance already exists in status quo, Madam Speaker. Their policy is nothing different. Under their policy, the only change that happens is that pedophiles might go to jail for a shorter period of time. That's still being a crime, that's still being treated as a criminal, and the perception of the society with respect to pedophiles still remains the same. They want a narrow debate, we'll give you one. Our policy is very simple. We think we will not give you a default assumption of being mentally ill as long as if you commit an act of pedophilia. We're not going to have a blanket policy where we say that all pedophiles are mentally ill, and we won't give you that advantage when going into a trial. We'll have a case-by-case analysis. If you're actually psychologically insane, Madam Speaker, we're okay with taking that into account. But we will say that not all pedophiles are born equal. There are many individuals who have urges of different levels, Madam Speaker, and not all of them are uncontrollable or cannot be treated through other measures. There are urges which lead into many crimes. They never told us where the line is really drawn. I have 4 arguments for you. Firstly, the principle. Secondly, urges versus actions and where do we delineate crimes. Thirdly, why deterrent is extremely important. And fourthly, where exactly do people come out for treatment and what does that depend on, right? firstly the principle. We think, irrespective of inclinations, there are massive harms to vulnerable party which we need to prevent. It's really shameful that Rubin talks about homosexuals. He said that if you're homosexual, that's an urge you cannot control. That does not mean that you get to rape people of the same gender, Madam Speaker. Just because you have sexual addiction does not mean that you're free to go around having sex with anyone you want. Irrespective of your certain inclinations, there are massive harms to a party which need to be prevented. All instances, or many instances of crime often involve a personal evaluation of your inclinations and or an ability for the law to prevent that act from happening. We think in many instances there are urges to things like sexual violence, Madam Speaker, or to violence in and of itself, or to things like theft, or to engaging in violence or domination of other individuals. Those are also inclinations and urges which may lead to crimes. That does not mean that we suddenly give a separate status of treating them as different individuals. Urges, before I go on, yes.
The difference is those urges are treated with disorders. They are proven coping methods if you have that sort of inclination towards violence, whereas with pedophilia, there is none.
Okay, that's not true. We think not all pedophiles have desires which they cannot control. It's false to say that all pedophiles are born the same. It's unfair to paint all individuals with the same brush and say that anyone who commits an act of sexual violence or has sex with a child is automatically a biological pedophile, Madam Speaker. That's the kind of assumption that they want for pedophiles going into trial in the first place. We think that's not right. We think also urges come in many shapes and actions, like shapes and forms. Where exactly do you draw the line? To what extent are you okay with considering certain actions against individuals caused by certain urges rather than the act in and of itself? We think that's a problem. We must recognize that deterrence is extremely important in cases of pedophilia. And there are two kinds of deterrence which exist in status quo. The first is the harshness of jail time. The fact that we send individuals to jail in the harshest form possible is extremely important when dealing with pedophilia. Why? We agree that there are certain urges and there is an ability for individuals to control those urges. But we think that ability is directly hinged on the fear that they have of going to jail. The fact that ever since you're a small child, you're instilled with the fear of being treated by the law enforcement and being sent to jail, or being incarcerated for extremely long periods of time is often crucial in actually instilling that fear in these individuals. Like categorizing this as a disorder rather than a crime in itself reduces the barrier to committing such actions in the first place. We admit it is possible that the treatment of those pedophiles is marginally better under their paradigm after they've committed the act. But before the act is committed, Madam Speaker, the deterrent is far lower. All the methods that they talked about, things like treatment for pedophiles, is non-mutually exclusive. That can happen under both paradigms when they're treated as criminals, sent to jail, and also given that treatment. We can also have like a treatment for pedophiles, or have campaigns in which you ask people who have such tendencies to come out and seek treatment before engaging in the act in and of itself. Those are non-mutually exclusive. But secondly, public condemnation and stigma is extremely important. The fact that you often have massive public condemnation and stigma reduces the ability and forces pedophiles to be wary of acting out. The fact that there are harsh laws enforced and society condemns you for acting against a vulnerable individual means that ever since you are small and ever since you grow up in society, there's massive social condemnation against it. The moment you reduce this social condemnation and allow these people to play the pity card, for example, or feel empathetic towards their cause, it reduces the barriers for these individuals to act out against these things. Yes?
The moment there is state recognition that this is a disorder, by extension, you normalize the treatment of these pedophilic urges. So people are more willing to come forward anyway. Okay,
we are saying that those things are non-mutually exclusive. That brings me on to my third point. How many people come out to seek treatment before they commit the act is independent of whether the act in itself is criminal or not. It's the same as you treat kleptomaniacs before they commit the crime. The fact that sex addicts are often treated, and there are awareness and therapy programs to treat these individuals. The number of people who come out to seek this treatment is independent whether or not you criminalize the act in and of itself. It's often contingent on the quality of psychological help or awareness that you can provide to these individuals. And that's not non-mutually exclusive, right? You can still treat the act of pedophilia and acting on your urges as a crime, but the disposition in and of itself can be treated as a mental illness, as happens in many instances, right? Things like kleptomania, or things like depression, for example, or massive sexual depravity, or other psychological dispositions or illnesses which don't lead into crimes can still be treated as illnesses, and people who haven't committed the act can still seek treatment under our policy. Their burden from side proposition was to prove why these people should not be incarcerated. why these individuals should not be treated as criminals and shouldn't go through the same process as any other criminals. If they actually want to achieve things like change in social perception towards these people, you do absolutely nothing. You just send them to jail for a few years than you would under status quo. Like sending a pedophile to jail for 5 years instead of 10 doesn't change social perceptions about these individuals. Things like changing social perceptions can happen irrespective of whether you send them to jail or not, and those are things which are mutually exclusive. SMU and Ruben in typical style has obviously squirreled the motion. The motion calls upon him to defend a situation in which you don't send these people to jail, in which you opt for other rehabilitative treatments without incarceration, Madam Speaker, in which you treat these as individuals who, for example, juveniles who are not sent to jail or only sent to part-time correctional facilities. Those are the kind of things that you need to defend from side proposition. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
So much to clarify.
Okay, we thank the opposition leader for his comments. Looking in the case for the bench, we invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
First clarification that we need to make, which is why this is not a squirrel, right? Basically, in terms of sexual attraction, right, or in terms of pedophilia, there are a couple of things that we change as compared to the status quo. So, for example, viewing or even owning child pornography is a crime that can land you with some amount of jail time under the status quo. But in our policy, you would then be assigned to a mental institution. You wouldn't get any kind of punitive treatment under that. You get treatment similar to someone who has a disorder. Similarly, the rape of children would not be treated as a special crime that needs to be punished more harshly than the rape of an adult. So we don't see why if 10 years or 20 years in prison is enough for a normal rapist, just because you raped a child and it's seen as morally different and more outrageous to society, that you deserve a higher punishment. We don't think that that's the case. So there are substantive differences between how we treat these people and how side opposition would want to treat them. But there's this incredibly confusing argument that's come from Aditya, which has to be clarified. Because he's okay with allowing, in some instances, people to seek out treatment. If, for instance, where he analogizes it to kleptomania. So he said that for kleptomania, for example, is a legit defense for you to have. So our argument was that the same thing should apply to pedophilia. But he said that preemptively, you should be allowed to seek treatment for kleptomania and the like, but not then for pedophilia. Or that the disposition should be treated as a crime. This is a phrase used which hasn't made any sense. How does the disposition to commit a particular act or to be attracted to children in and of itself constitute a crime? Because this is exactly what he said, that they would treat that as the criminal component and not necessarily acting upon it, or that there would be diminished liability when you act upon it because you have a disorder. So we don't understand. I just don't understand what this means. They need to clarify it. So then they told you that, look, homosexuals don't get to rape. This is the same reason why we were okay with sending these people to jail, because children are unable to consent to sexual relations. So the same way as a homosexual, you don't have a right to rape another person. In today's society, you don't have a right to have sex with a child who's below the age of majority, because it often involves things like an unfair power dynamic. And if it involves things like coercion or things like violence, we're okay with punishing you and sending you to jail for using those things. But we're not okay with treating it as a special crime, as is done in status quo, where the rape of children is seen as a different and a more heinous type of crime. Sit down, sit down, sit down. But then they told you that, look, you have natural urges towards things like violence, and they come in many different shapes and forms. And we're okay with starting to analyze as to whether you show these predispositions. So whether you ever viewed child porn before, or whether you, I don't know, whether you ask your girlfriend to dress younger than she already would, there are possibly ways for you to determine whether there's some inclination to believe that this person might be a genuine pedophile versus someone who just happened to rape a child this time or not. So we don't understand why that POI has to be such a big problem in terms of how we're going to ever determine this. But then they wanted to talk about deterrence, right? In terms of the harshness of jail time. But the ability to control this, according to them, is based on fear. But if there is a natural disposition for you to be attracted to children, why is we think of fear of being jailed longer and longer periods for it isn't a particularly good way for these people to come to terms with it. And I'm going to explain this in my argumentation, but it doesn't. But you're focused to reconcile your moral compass to someone. You're told that what you did was wrong, and the way you behave in society is not like this. But the fact of the matter is that if people are naturally predisposed to believe that this is how they view reality, and they can't help but be sexually attracted to children or younger people per se, we don't see how a longer jail sentence allows you to reflect and come to some kind of moral conclusion that this is wrong, given that it's a genetic thing that you might experience, right? Then they told you that, look, but it's possible for you to have interventions before the act, right? But that's much more likely under our side, where you acknowledge that it's a disorder. So when people start viewing things like child porn, it's possible for you to stage an intervention. It's possible for you to have support, for like political support, to organize support groups, because if you don't see it as a disorder, but you see it purely as a criminal act, why on earth would you ever have support groups or interventions for people who are harboring criminal thoughts? They're seen as dangerous, who need to be locked away, because it isn't ever possible for you to have a natural inclination towards being criminal or something that you can't help. You're told that something you should be able to help, but that doesn't necessarily apply to the case of pedophiles, right? Before I move on my argumentation, I'll take one.
Under your policy, is everyone who has sex with a child given the benefit of the doubt, rather than a case-by-case analysis like in status quo?
I already told you, right? Just because you assert, if you accept that something like schizophrenia or kleptomania is a possible defense, you still need to ascertain whether a legitimate defense is being made in that instance. So whether this person is a legitimate pedophile or whether this person is a legitimate kleptomaniac can be ascertained through the judicial process. We can do the same thing. So I don't see what the problem is if you're okay with doing it in some defenses. Let's look at two main points of extension. Firstly, why it's irresponsible for the government to denounce these individuals, and secondly, how incarceration effectively destroys these people. We think it's irresponsible because to say that because the current status quo already brands them as the worst form of criminal, because you lock them away and you deny them any ability to reconcile their perception of reality or what they find sexually arousing through their natural instincts with what the societal consensus is, because they can't help in certain instances, which they also concede, to help but be attracted to those below the age of majority. And so locking them up requires them to overcome their base instinct, but jail offers no way for you to be able to do this, because you aren't given the necessarily psychological help or treatment that you require or learn how to cope with these things and recognize that it isn't okay for you to go about acting upon these urges. It's not a problem with your moral compass, but learning to be able to control a disorder. And because of the vulnerability of children which exists in society, you're not allowed to enter into sexual relationships with them. But locking them away leads to a couple of problems, right? These are often the people who get abused, especially in prisons, because even among criminals, they're seen as a worst kind of criminal. They're seen as disgusting and people who deserve punishment, who deserve us lashing out against them. And this leads into how society also views these people. The impression is similar, that they're one of the worst types of criminal, and that their morality is so different from us that it must necessarily be because they're so evil that they choose to act in this manner. And the only way to solve it is to lock them up for longer and longer periods of time. But that narrative changes when you label it as a disorder, because it's not necessary, because you focus then on how to get them to cope with their disorder, not necessarily on branding them as evil people who aren't able to change how they are. Secondly, why do we think that incarceration then specifically hurts these people, right? Because we don't think you actually have a way of rehabilitating these people solely in prison, right? Because if it is a base desire, if it is a part of what makes you feel human and what feels natural to you, and like that's denied to you, and you're told that you're evil because you're unable to control those things, what you necessarily then have to do is either reconcile the fact that you're some kind of monster, or that the society out there is wrong, and that you should have a right to be able to do these things. This is analysis that Ruben brought to you, right? That when you're locked away without any kind of support structure, when you're unable to feel any kind of similarity or support from the society that you're in, is when you start resenting society, is when you start drawing away from them, and then deciding whether to act on these urges if they come to overcome you. That you don't realize it's something you have to manage, but it's just something that you're told is wrong with you, and you start accepting that it is something wrong with you, and whether or not you have the self-control is entirely subjective. We think that we improve the situation of pedophiles and the problem of pedophilia, and for all of these reasons, we oppose.
Okay. We thank the previous speaker for his speech. We'll begin the case for the offense. We invite the deputy opposition leader.
Today, their case is suffered from two major flaws. Firstly, a deliberate intellectual detachment from the fact that generally in crimes, right, actions constitute parts of criminality. Secondly, an emotional detachment from the very fact of the harms, the third-party harms that pedophilia can create. Before I move on to my case proper, let's deal with three rebuttals. Firstly, what a crime really is, Law 101. Let's be honest, right? A crime happens when society's laws are broken. And this breaking of laws very basically happens through action and with intention, both of them. Therefore, if they were to prove, right, basically that some pedophilic inclinations exist, that only affects intention, but we don't think the action is therefore affected. We think it's very unfair for them to define pedophilia as only being about the disposition, right? Because how do you expect us to fairly defend the punishment of pure emotional disposition? Basically, how do you even notice that it exists, right? Do you have definite proof where you say, oh, I think that he feels pedophilic, so let's do something about it? We don't think there's a fair burden in any case. Furthermore, right, we realize that pedophilic inclinations can always exist on a gradation, something Aditya already told you. Therefore, it's supremely unfair for you to create this very spurious link between pedophilia and everything else. Furthermore, we realize, right, that when we talk about punishing pedophilia as a crime, we are going for action. We think the action cannot be separate from inclination in this debate. So we look at things like sexual acts with a child. But one way we do differ from them, right, is looking at the idea of child porn, which we also think is illegal. And given that it's the one area we differ, given that submitted to our definition, I will deal with that a bit more later. So to put it extremely simply, right, for us to discuss any legal context, any idea of criminality, the definition of pedophilia must include some degree of action. So we would want them really to finally bite the bullet on what this debate is about. But given that we are the ones that truly provide a fairer interpretation of what the keywords of this debate are, right, we think we see in them an agreement with us that sentencing and liability still occurs, still stands for the action of pedophilia, except they're not really sure what kind of rape they want it to be. So we do think that already at 2 minutes we take this debate. But I will go down anyway. No, thank you, sir. Let's move on to the idea of why we think criminality is warranted for pedophilia. So let's put it this way, right? When you talk about pedophilic acts, you look at things like Huang Na in Singapore, who was kidnapped and then raped and left for dead. We look at child trafficking in the Philippines, in Thailand. We look at children who are trafficked away to take part not only in prostitution, but in pornography and child sex chat rooms. That is a horrible reality of what is being done to feed pedophilic urges around the world. No, thank you, sir. We find it abhorrent because of, firstly, the irreversible and permanent physical and emotional damage done to innocent children. We also look at how this goes against all society stands for with regards to the protected status of the child. Furthermore, we realize that there's many manifestations of pedophilic urges, right, especially the child porn they're happy to approve of, is premeditated on a large scale. When people log on and stream child porn and watch it, they are basically supporting an entire franchise that takes children away from their home and exploits them for the pleasure of other people. That is gross third-party harm done to the children. We don't see how, whether it be on their definition or our definition, that can be considered legally acceptable. But before I move on to look at how it's different from something like depression, right, I'll take a point.
When a kleptomaniac is arrested for stealing, his kleptomania is treated as a disorder and is viewed as a mitigating factor. So it's placed in a separate institution. What we're doing is extending this to pedophilia, where it's not currently treated as a disorder.
Yeah, that agrees with everything I'm saying. The fact is, you can't make us defend the inclination, a pedophilic inclination, a liking for a child and no action as a crime. There is no way you can bring it into court and defend it. There's no evidence. There's no way you have any admissible proof in court. That is why you must accept that any debate about pedophilia today must engage with bolder action. Therefore, it's a debate about something like theft instigated by kleptomania, right? Would you want to consider the theft criminally chargeable or not? That is what the debate is really about. So it's really different from things like depression, right? Where if a relapse happens, where someone has a depressed episode of depression, right? Your first priority is, well, to get this person treatment, to get to the hospital, because he can't help feeling that way. But when it comes to pedophilia, right, if you have an attack of, I don't know, mental pedophilia, then the first thing you do is to save the child in need. The fact that you prioritize the third party harm already shows why criminal liability must exist. Furthermore, we realize, right, that we have to put the child first, the criminal hurt to the child first, because of how we view the child, right? In society, the child is special because of social economic pragmatics. When we look after the child, so to raise him or her for the future. When we look at the child in terms of his political status as someone to be protected, where society in general has great emotional attachment and valuation of the child as someone too innocent for your sexual impositions, someone who is too vulnerable for you to force your will upon or to give meaningful consent. That is why this whole idea of normalizing pedophilic urges from pratique is something completely unacceptable to all society stands for with regards to the child. Moving on, right, let's look at the idea of stopping pedophilia. And we think that when you talk about stopping pedophilia and pedophilic acts, there is a conception that action is intertwined with any discussion of pedophilic inclinations on their part. So action and criminalizing it is really the issue. So they came out and talked about how you want to treat them as maybe normal or like the rapist, and then he dilly-dallies and says, oh, maybe it's about patients, maybe it's about rapists. We see already a concession that you cannot separate the act of rape of a child and the inclination to do so. But furthermore, we realize, right, that the deterrent effect of treatment that Aditya talked about, if needed, basically means that you will stop excusing yourself as a victim and see a need to get yourself cured, see a need to get counseling before you are thrown into imprisonment for the actual action itself. We don't see any engagement with that on our grounds. But on both grounds, on the idea of stigma that happens on both sides, we think that stigma basically makes you decide not to indulge yourself in a disorder without thinking about the real implications they're carrying on a different party, on an innocent child. Because if the welfare of the child is central, that cannot be neglected. That brings me nicely on and very quickly to my substantive today on why we do with regards to the traction of pedophilic organizations. We see in states like the US, right, in the Men Love Boys Association, where basically they not only fight for the affirmation of a sentiment on their part, but also legalization of actual actions of pedophilic rape. So what we see is that the rhetoric of disorder allows them to get more traction because now it's seen as not their fault, not a crime, something society should not reject. We think this is extremely harmful because it allows them to move towards getting more legalization of pedophilic acts. We think this also shakes the faith in the legal system to execute any protection of the child that is so fundamental to many laws and ideas in society, right? And it upsets civilians' faith in law when they realize basically that things like child porn are no longer considered condemnable by society. We realize that courts are based on reflecting public sentiment, and we think the public outrage therefore comes from realizing that it can no longer truly reflect what we think about children is extremely abhorrent and will compromise any order that law can bring to society. For all those reasons, therefore, we believe that you cannot distinguish pedophilia in terms of the action, and for those reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker previous for her speech. We call on the government whip.
We isolate the criminalization of pedophilia by saying that child rape is no more heinous than normal rape. That's how we look at the case, right? So we say there's no, like, obviously if you coerce a 30-year-old woman to have sex with you versus a 14-year-old, we treat it as equivalent. We do not impose additional criminality for the pedophilic side of your tendencies. So of course, it's not our burden to say you can do whatever you want with a child, because if you use violence, then of course you can still be held accountable for it, because it's not a direct result of your pedophilia. The choice of your victim, however, is a direct result of your pedophilia. We don't think you should receive additional punishment for the choice of your victim. So on the first issue, let's take a look at how do we adjudicate criminality, right? So we think when we look at someone who is motivated by intention to hurt a victim, we say we cannot treat pedophilia as a crime which requires additional punitive measures because we think that's inappropriate. Because we think unlike someone who physically abuses children, a pedophile most of the time means no harm to the child. It's an intention to cultivate a loving or sexual relationship with someone. A pedophile has no more intention to hurt a child any more than a homosexual intends to hurt all men. For example, we say the difference then between the two is that pedophiles cannot possibly find consensual parties simply because children lack the capacity to consent. So we agree, right? You are raping the child, but the fact that the victim is a child shouldn't be relevant to your crime. Let's move on, because these individuals can't choose what they're sexually attracted to. So it thinks unfair that any expression of pedophilic tendencies within the status quo are very often cracked down upon. That's why we tell you that it's problematic that the FBI track down people watching child porn and throw them into prison. We say, of course, you should crack down on the producers of child porn the same way you should crack down on the producers of drugs. But just as it's not necessary to have excessive punitive punishments of those people who consume drugs, we don't think it's necessary to jail people who watch child porn because it is morally equivalent to a gay person watching gay porn. Yes, Aditya.
You said that you were treated the same as normal rapists. That means they still go to jail for 10, 15, 20 years. How do you reconcile that with your argumentations about the harms of incarceration and social stigma?
No, because we treat their crime based on the fact that they're a victim as something that especially special, and we ignore the fact that it is a disorder that needs to be treated, right? That ran across our entire case. I don't understand why you can't understand that. So more importantly, we also explain to them that it's only when we recognize, for example, that this is a mental disorder, is it possible then to stage an intervention? Is it possible then to prescribe treatment to cope and manage their sexual desires? Because unless we recognize pedophilia as such, rather than as a criminal tendency, we can't possibly mobilize a support structure from society willing to go ahead to do this. So how do we then help these pedophiles? And let's take a look at what Aditya said. Aditya's analysis was extremely simplistic. He simply said that harsher punishments will be more effective in deterring. So he said that you should have a harsher form of jail time depending on whether or not your victim is an adult or a child because of this special crime that you had to indulge your sexual tendencies. And the point we're trying to make here is to indulge in your sexual tendencies isn't a special form of crime. It is normal. We think if 10 years is sufficient for a rapist to be deterred, why do we need additional jail time for child rapists, right? So at the end of, we need to consider two things. First of all, we need to consider proportionality. All we're trying to say is that two crimes are proportional and hence need to be treated the same way, right? And secondly, we think the moment you treat pedophilia as an illness instead of a crime, and you then no longer need to ascribe a lengthier jail sentence on these individuals. You have a similar length of punishment, but you also put them in a psychiatric facility so that you ensure that you can help them cope and manage with their tendencies so that they can rehabilitate as well. But then what did Hui tell us? Hui told us that, oh, if we treat it as psychological disorder and put them in a psychiatric facility, it will legitimize their actions. It will somehow give political will for lobby groups to lower the age of consent. But the last time I checked, if you're sent to a psychiatric facility, you're seen as crazy. Something is seen to be wrong with you. That hardly legitimizes you as an action group, right? Yes, sir.
Do you think homosexuals should be punished less harshly for the rape of someone of the same sex?
I think they should be punished equally as, like, a homosexual who rapes a guy should be punished as the same as a guy who rapes a girl. The fact that it's homosexual shouldn't constitute or lead to an additional punishment, right? Like, so, yeah. So the fact that you're having sexual relations with someone without their consent is the crime, right? The sexual tendency itself doesn't add to the crime that you're committing. Let's move on to a question of what's the counterfactual on their side when they treat pedophilic tendencies as a special form of crime that they need punished more. We say when pedophilians are castigated, not just for the actions that they committed, but also for their own sexuality. We think that's when it's difficult for people to dare to come out of the closet, for example, because they're no longer seen as someone with strange sexual practices, but they're seen as a potential criminal, a monster that needs to be cracked down upon by the law, someone the government needs to protect society from. The approach of punishing the pedo away rather than teaching him how to cope with it is that after he comes out of, like, we question first of all, how is he going to reconcile with himself within prison that he's actually not a horrible person, and more importantly, after he comes out of prison, he's still going to be treated as a very special form of criminal. There's going to be, and the stigma is so much further that nobody wants to talk to him. No one wants to treat you like a human being because they see you as a monster. The problem then is that these individuals, without their support structure, without their network, who are left to their own devices, a society doesn't recognize their problem as something that's psychological, right? Cannot then find any meaning within their life due to discrimination that they face. We say that's when they can no longer resist their basic desires. We say the same reason why prostitutes who are victims of human trafficking cannot find meaning in their life and hence are more likely to turn to drugs as a form of psychological escape. We say the child rapist who's castigated for his sexuality is going to turn to the same thing, because when you can no longer find the meaning in your life, you turn to the only things that you know, your most basic desires that you can appeal to, that can make you feel some sort of sexual fulfillment within your life. And we say that's only normal. The problem is, under their side, even after I get out of jail, if I view child porn again, I'm going to be thrown into jail. All we're saying is that pedophilia is not necessarily criminal.
Next speaker, please, for his speech. Opposition Whip.
The most offensive statement we heard from Alfred was that acting on urges are normal and not a crime because they were just acting on urges. By that logic, we never understood why any sexual crime was considered a crime on that side, because all sexual crime is built on sexual urges that they can't control and that they feel, and that's a disorder. And on that logic, every sexual crime is considered in the same logic of being a disorder and should be treated mentally and not in terms of crimes. What we never heard on that side was why the distinction of attraction to children was somehow more of a disorder than attraction to adult women, or attraction to a homosexual, to a man of your same gender, or to a person of the same gender. We don't think children specifically made any distinction in that case, because on this side we think that children have a special status on one hand, but on secondly, we think even if they didn't have a special status, that the fact that these individuals were imposing an action on another individual simply because they felt a certain way was still a crime, and they deserved to be punished for it. We're going to be very clear in this speech. One, we tell you team stance on side opposition is very clear, that regardless of the nature of the mental inclination, we don't care if you're attracted to a child or to a tree. The manifestations of those inclinations have harm on a vulnerable party that the state has a duty to protect. We give you two reasons for that. One, that not all pedophilic behavior automatically counts as a disorder, because you have a range of urges and a range of reasons as to why you would or would not act on those urges in different scenarios and circumstances with different impacts on different numbers of people and different victims. That is why whether or not you get your action gets counted as a disorder or as a crime depends on your scenario in the court of law and in trial and in discretion by expert witnesses, and not as a blanket policy where as long as you have sex with a child, you're automatically considered someone with a mental disorder and be sent to a facility and given like luxury treatment instead of a jail sentence. But secondly, we told you that we're happy to consider a person having pedophilic urges as a disorder because the simple urges part of the debate, we're happy to concede it's a disorder. The problem is the acting on the urges and how you deserve to be punished for those actions because of the irreversible and permanent physical and psychological damage that possibly can be caused on hundreds of kids at a time. This order doesn't even come close to describing the actions of a man that acts on those urges. On government side, we never understood what their end goal really was. Because on one hand, they wanted to get them acceptance and help and remove the stigma on them because they're actually the victims here. They really have these disorders and urges and they can't do anything about it and they need help. But on the other hand, they want to treat them like regular rapists, still give them your 10, 15, 20 years in jail, and therefore all the harms that an incarcerated individual still faces, like the stigma of being a criminal and the stigma of being in jail, still exists upon them. Which means that the government case is to make them a criminal with a lower sentence when it was their burden to prove that they were not criminals, period. We don't think they fulfilled their burden on that side. We don't think at the end of this debate that they've managed to prove to us that it should be a disorder as opposed to a crime instead of a disorder as part of a crime. Let's look at two big things. One, what should the state do and what is the state's responsibility? Secondly, how do we help the people with a predisposition to pedophilia? What should the state do? We think that the state has a responsibility to protect the most vulnerable sections of society. And we're happy to defend an opposition that children deserve the special status of protection that they have because of their vulnerability and potential for long-term irreversible damage. Because this is crime against minors who not only can't consent, but whose consent is often forced out of them because they're groomed from young ages through child trafficking rings and huge prostitution bars, often by their parents themselves, meaning they have no way of consent whatsoever. We think that the difference in this scenario is that the moral abhorrence of pedophilic action should be maintained by the state. Because the state has a responsibility to protect the vulnerable sections of society that have no way out of it. Therefore, deterring the crime against this section of society is a priority to the state. If we can manage the disorder simultaneously, we're happy to do that on our side. But we think that the priority is ensuring that these individuals are deterred from actually committing that crime. How is this done? We told you earlier that because of the range of urges that each individual has, oftentimes the jail sentence in itself and the harms of jail and the dangers of jail and all the characterizations they want to talk about act as a deterrent for these individuals to act on the urges that they have and instead seek help for these urges and solve the issues that they have before they act on the crime, instead of actually committing the action first and then going, oh, it's a disorder, come and help me. In the meantime, you have victims who have been traumatized for the rest of their lives, and that's a problem. When we tell you that the state has a responsibility to ensure that these individuals get the help before the action, we think that there's a huge difference between attraction and imposition. Because we allow you to be homosexual, but just because you are homosexual doesn't mean you're allowed to rape a man because you're acting on your sexual urges for another man. We think it's extremely clear the line between your thoughts and what you do with those thoughts specifically and how you seek help. For this, we need to look at how then do you help an individual with a predisposition to pedophilia. Before that, go.
There are some people who will exploit children because they perceive them as vulnerable and easy to exploit. And there are those who will do it because they can't help but be attracted to no one else but children. So don't you think that these two classes of criminals should be punished differently because they aren't as equally evil or as equally difficult to rehabilitate?
Yes, that was the op case, and it was exactly the opposite to what Gov case wanted. Because the Gov case was to say that anyone who had committed pedophilic action deserved disorder treatment and to be put into a mental facility. It was op case today that told you that not everyone that acted on the urge to have child sex automatically was qualified as a pedophile with a disorder, but a pedophile that just exploited a child because that child was available to him. We think that how you help someone with a predisposition to pedophilia is to use the act of deterrence to urge him to not commit the action, but instead come forward to get the help before committing the action. Which is why all of the policy things that Ruben wanted to talk about at the start of this debate, your funding of research, your support groups, your ability to have all of these activities or help for these individuals can be done on our side. And we're fine on our side to say that you help these individuals solve their pedophilic urges before they commit the action. Because we think that the deterrent of jail sentence ensures that these individuals, or at least some of these individuals, don't commit the crime and are afraid of committing the crime and therefore have a reason to step forward and seek and get the help that they need. We think that what happens under their paradigm is an allowance for them to commit the crime first and then accept that it's a disorder after committing the crime. That is the problem that we're not willing to accept, because the kinds of third-party harms that come out of it and the minors that get irreversibly damaged because of it are not worth it. We're very proud to oppose.
Sorry, check. Who is replying?
This debate kind of sucks. Alright. Can I start? No, I can't start. Okay.
I would thank the previous speaker for her speech. To close the opposition case, we invite the opposition to reply.
So I began by saying this debate sucks, right? I was wrong. It really, really sucks. So let's move away from arguments that make no sense and attempts at skirting. Let's talk about people, alright? Let's start somewhere a bit easier. So say there's a person in my midst who feels lust for children, inclinations, like they say, but this person has not acted on it. The question they want to make this debate about, right, is whether this is something that should be criminalized. There is a problem. How is it even possible to argue this from opposition? To use an analogy, if I am angry with you and I feel like punching you in the face, but I don't do it and I don't express it, so there's no action of hurt, there is no threat, how can I be brought before the law for battery, for assault? There is no rationale whatsoever. There is no witness to my crime. There is no real evidence. There is no real third-party harm. There is no real societal detriment. That is precisely why this debate that they have said is entirely unfair for us. But let's move on a bit. How about the iota disorder? Does he need treatment? Well, if you think he does, the fact that he will only go for treatment for this so-called disorder if he recognizes the harm of what is feeding, the potential harm of translating his feeding into action, that is precisely we think that societal stigma that they reject is good, that the deterrent effect of any action based on his sentiment being seen as a crime is good, because they then realize that this so-called disorder, this disordered sentiments are basically sentiments that desire to find your own pleasure in a child's body, in a body whose pre-pubescent state that the country wants to protect is taken for you as an object for your own selfish and hurtful sexual pleasure. If you don't see the harm of such impulses, right, and say, okay, I'm just going to watch child porn, well, we don't think the person is going to want to seek counseling in the long run. So the treatment point does fall to our side. To bring it even further, right, I brought you a case in my deputy speech where basically the legitimization of the sentiments is nothing more but just inclinations that are disordered, that I'm a victim of my inclinations, means that people are more likely to campaign for these sentiments that you can't help to be legally affirmed. Let's go on to the second idea. We have talked about people